Hardboard, or masonite, is one of those materials that doesn't find itself into fine furniture making all too often, but it is a very interesting product. Now, of course, we could go through and paint up a panel like this and use a painted panel for a field panel on a door. But I don't think painting is really all that creative at this stage of the game. So I thought, let's color this piece up with something. This is going to be my palette to create a pattern on this hardboard. I've got some padauk, walnut, and maple. And let's try some experimentations with marquetry. Now, what I'm going to create on this is a very simple pattern. It would be prairie style, or perhaps even perceived as mission style. And it's actually a pattern that I had done in stained glass a couple of years back. And it's a very simple pattern. So let's see if we can't transform this very ordinary piece of hardboard into something very attractive. To get started, we're going over to the table saw. Now, when thinking about doing marquetry work and working with veneers, the traditional veneer saw seems to be the tool that pops into mind right away. However, as tradition would have it here at Woodworking at Home, we're not going to always show you the traditional way of doing things. While filming a story for another company, I met up with a woodworker whose name is Adolf Schneider. I'm still hoping that we can do a story on him sometime in the near future, but he demonstrated some techniques that were just astounding regarding doing veneer work and marquetry. And all of his cutting was done at the table saw, which really shocked me. Generally, old world craftsmen stick to the old world ways, but he pioneered some new techniques to use the table saw for cutting all his veneer. Frankly, I've been using it ever since, and I really love the techniques. Now, there's just a couple of things that you need to keep in mind when cutting thin veneers on the table saw. First is your fence. If you're using your fence, it has to be close enough to the table surface where the veneer can't slide under. Mine sits right on top of the table surface, so my veneers won't slide under. If yours sits up higher, you can always clamp on an auxiliary board onto your fence that rides right on the table surface. Another very important aspect is to have a zero clearance insert plate on your table saw, one that's in good condition. You don't want these thin veneers to be pulled down in that wide gap on a standard throat plate. Many tooth blade, as many teeth as you can get, is often very helpful. I'm using my standard Forest Woodworker 2 saw blade, and I've had real good results with that. I also use the grippers to feed the stock through when I'm doing these cutting operations. It holds the veneers down tight against the table surface and provides me with a nice safe way of feeding the stock through the saw blade. So now what we'll do is we'll just go through and rip up some strips for our pattern. Now at this point I've got my strips ripped to their width, and it's so-so on the look. Now my original intent was actually to put some 1/4-inch walnut strips between the padauk and the maple to create the leaded portion of the stained glass. And it looks okay, but on this small of a panel I think it's just too busy and I don't think they're needed. So I'm going to part with those. Just go back to the padauk and the maple. Now in this area here I wanted a series of small rectangles, so I needed to divide that area up. So I'm going to place 3 strips in here about like so. And sizing this rectangular portion, there's a number of formulas you can use in design, the golden mean, the 3/5, 2/5 rule, and so forth. But if I'm following those, the rectangle's too long and narrow for my eye. So I decided to part ways with the rules and just kind of move it around and get a visual. Once I see something that I like, somewhere about like that, I think that's pretty close to what I want. Now what I'll do is I'll measure that length so I know what size to cut these little rectangles to. Now we'll go back over to the table saw and cut these maple pieces into short rectangular pieces. I'll first square up the end here at the miter saw with a backer board. I'll take my maple pieces and just take a cut to square them up. Now earlier when we were ripping the strips, I had mentioned that if your fence rides high on the table surface and your veneer is allowed to slide under the fence, you'd have to clamp on an auxiliary board. Here you can see a configuration of that. It's nothing more than a couple pieces of MDF that I've glued together at a right angle, and I've allowed one leg to extend over. And that way, as I'm feeding stock through, with the clamps in the way, it would of course hit my feed block and so forth. So by putting this extra leg down there, it extends the fence over and gets it out of the way. So now I can safely feed all the way across and not bump my hand against the clamps. And of course this piece sits nice and flat against the table surface. Now after I got it all assembled in this right angle configuration, all I did was move the rip fence over and took a cut along this edge so that it's nice and straight. Now we'll continue with our cutting of the small blocks for this veneer, and we'll do the Padauk pieces first. And we need these pieces to be the same length, we're cross-cutting now, as the width is of our maple pieces. Now back here you can see I've got my dial indicator back on the table saw like we've shown in other segments, and that allows me to precisely position my fence around. Now I did, at the compound miter saw, square up this one end. And of course you could cut this veneer in a number of different ways. We're just showing the techniques that I've like to share with you that I've been using. Now it is square, but it's so small it's very easy to get it crooked like this. So what I like to do is take a drafting triangle, bump that up against my fence, get my veneer piece squared up, and then I'll take my push block and put that right on top of the veneer, and now I can cross cut it to an exact length. And I'll just continue this cross-cutting operation for the remaining pieces. Well, I think the pattern's looking really good at this point. Keep in mind you're looking at it upside down. This is the bottom. I think I like the grain and everything, especially for an experimental piece, and I think we're ready to tape everything together. Now this top edge of all my strips is cut off square, so that'll be sort of my baseline. And I'm going to tape everything together on the backing material, so that helps me to keep everything square. Working along this top edge here, where everything's good and square on each of my pieces, I'll just start bringing all the pieces together and taping them up. And I'm using regular old veneer tape. There are other tapes that can be used for this application, but we'll cover that in a future story. Now along these areas where I've got all these little pieces, I actually ended up with a nice straight line because I was very precise on my cuts, but had it been a regular, I'd have just taken it back over to the table saw and taken a real light skim cut along that edge to even up the surface. And with everything taped together and the excess trimmed off our marquetry work, we can get some glue on our backer board and get that spread around. Now I'm working with liquid hide glue, and I found that it actually works very well for veneering. But what I have also found is that if I work too fast and I get too much glue on here, it bleeds through the veneers, because these veneers that I'm using right now are very thin. So I just get a nice thin film on my backer board, and then I'll let this sit for a few minutes while it starts to dry and tack up. Now if this were actually going into a cabinet, I'd be veneering both sides so that this panel wouldn't all warp up. But just for our exploratory series here, I'm just going to veneer the one side. Now I'll be putting all this in a vacuum press. So I've got a platen. Here's one of them. A piece of cork, and that cork will compress, and that will handle the unevenness and the thickness of the different pieces of veneer. Now I know I'll probably get a little bleed through, and I don't want to glue the cork to my pattern, so I'll put on a couple of pieces of heavy paper. Take our piece, place it on there, and then a top platen. And you'll see all these grooves cut in here, and that's to allow the air to flow through so you get good compression in the vacuum press. Now we'll just put all this in the bag. Now the vacuum bag is something you build yourself, or you can buy them. And it's just a heavy gauge vinyl, sealed up on all but one end. Get our platens lined up directly over the top of each other. Our vacuum inlet hose is right over our platen, and then we'll clamp the one end to seal it up with a couple of cauls. Now we'll turn on the vacuum pump, and it'll take a few minutes to evacuate all the air in the bag, and it'll draw everything down good and tight. Panel, I've sanded it up and so forth, and I was actually hoping something would happen that didn't. As we've all been told, you have to veneer both sides of material so that you have balance in it. And what that means is, if this top veneer expands and contracts differently than the substrate material, what's going to happen is it's going to curl up on you. And I waited a day, then another day, and another day to get this panel to curl up so we could clearly demonstrate the effects of that. Unfortunately, I got maybe about a 1/16 inch of curl on it. It's very, very minimal, so we can't really go into that detail at this time. But suffice it to say, whenever you veneer a panel, you should always veneer both sides so that it stays in balance, so that as the front or face veneers expand and contract, the back ones are doing the same, keeping the panel flat. Now let's talk a little bit about this design. On paper, this looked better than it did in real life. I don't mind the color differences. We've got our bright maple and then this orangish Paduke, and this will darken up, so I know that'll change a little bit over time. But what really bothers me on this particular design is the width of the dark stripes. Now when I penciled this out originally, and then when I modified it to fit this panel for our demonstration purposes, I didn't take into account the solidness of these colors. Now on the stained glass portion, I used a very dark brown and then a relatively translucent but still a white glass in this area. And I thought that by just scaling everything, it was going to work out fine for this size panel. But with the opacity of the woods, the brown is far too prominent in the design. I think if I were to reduce the size or the width of each of these brown pieces by about 20%, it would have balanced out very nicely. But nonetheless, that's the whole point of doing these types of experiments, to learn about the different techniques, the different textures, what's working in design and what isn't. But all around, this will give you an idea of a very simple panel that you can do in marquetry that would serve very well as a field panel for a door. Now this would almost have to be a field panel in a frame and panel construction because you would have the exposed edges. But this should give you one idea of what you can do with veneers, a veneer press, and a little bit of time to create a very custom looking cabinet door. Now also, you can just use ordinary veneers. Well, perhaps this Bubinga isn't quite ordinary, but you don't have to work with patterns and marquetry and so forth. This happens to be a very economical grade of Bubinga. I picked it up in a large lot, and I've got a number of different sizes of this type of veneer, and it's been working out good for some experimentation that I've been doing here. Now, of course, this Bubinga would go with just about any species of wood. If we brought maple into the picture, that, of course, works very well. Almost all your earth tones and wood species work well and complement each other nicely. The nice thing about this Bubinga is you get a very three-dimensional effect with it. So when the sun is moving through the rooms or the lighting changes in a room, the panel constantly changes. And that really creates a tremendous visual effect on any type of furniture. Now, of course, you're looking at this pattern horizontal. Here it is vertical, looks just as attractive. And again, the lights change on it, and it creates different three-dimensional effects. Now, all I really did on this panel to get it to this stage was, after it was veneered or taken out of the veneer press, sanded it up at 220, and then just put a coat of oil on it, and that kind of pops the grain a little bit. So I'm cheating a little bit there, just to give an idea of what the grains will do for you. So this gives you an idea of how we can work with marquetry on a door field panel, as well as just plain veneers that can really dress up an ordinary cabinet and make it extraordinary. Furthermore, by using some various marquetry techniques, you can take a more modern piece of furniture and bring it into a style that's perhaps not quite modern, but you like the aspects of it. For example, this panel here could work very well on a nice modern piece, and it would bring in some of the design elements dating back to the early 1900s, which would be, of course, Prairie and Mission style. Well, I hope you found this issue informative. The one thing I really hope you come away with is the courage to experiment, to explore, and to try some of your own ideas, even if it's just in an explorative situation such as this. If you can't afford to go out and buy some hardwood to cut up into panels to do experimentation with, pick up a sheet of 4x8 MDF. You can pick that stuff up for about $15 a sheet, and it's a great blank canvas for you to try and experiment with all those ideas that are rolling around inside your mind's eye. I'm Chris DeHut for Woodworking at Home magazine. I hope you enjoyed this issue.